That quiet afternoon, a loud roar of engines suddenly broke the peaceful silence outside Isabella Grant's mansion. Several black SUVs pulled up quickly and stopped at the front gate. The guards straightened immediately, confused by the unexpected arrival. One by one, the doors of the SUVs opened and men in dark suits stepped out. They looked serious, powerful, and clearly in a hurry. Their faces were tense as they walked straight toward the security gate. One of the men quickly pulled out a photograph and showed it to the guards. "Have you seen this man?" he asked urgently. The guards leaned closer to study the photo, trying to understand what was going on. But before any of them could respond, something unexpected happened. The men suddenly looked past the gate toward the large garden inside the mansion. Their eyes widened in disbelief. Standing there, calmly watering the flowers as if nothing unusual was happening, was the exact same man from the photograph, the same face, the same person they had been searching for. One of the suited men stepped forward in shock and shouted loudly, "Sir!" The young man froze. The watering can slipped from his hand and fell softly onto the grass. Everyone at the gate stared in confusion. Just days ago, this was a man sitting quietly at a bus stop in torn clothes, a man people walked past without even looking, a man everyone believed was just another homeless beggar with nowhere to go. Yet now, a convoy of powerful men had arrived looking for him, calling him sir as if he was someone extremely important. Who was this mysterious man? Why were these powerful men searching for someone who had been homeless only days ago? And how did that same man end up living inside the mansion of one of the richest women in the city? Before we reveal the truth behind this unbelievable story, take a moment to support the channel. If you enjoy powerful, emotional stories like this one, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Now, let us go back to where this incredible story truly began. Long before the convoy of black SUVs ever appeared at the gate of her mansion, there lived a woman whose name everyone in the city knew. Her name was Isabella Grant. In the city, when people spoke about tall glass towers, shining luxury apartments, and the biggest shopping malls where crowds gathered every weekend, they were usually speaking about buildings that belonged to her. Isabella Grant was one of the richest real estate developers in the whole city. Her company had built roads, estates, office towers, and beautiful homes that touched the clouds. When she entered a meeting room, people stood up quickly. Some smiled with respect. Others kept quiet out of fear, because everyone knew Isabella Grant was a woman who did not play with business. She was strict, very strict. If a manager made a mistake, she would look at them calmly and say in a quiet voice, "If you cannot do the work properly, someone else will." And that would be the end of the discussion. Some people admired her strength. Others whispered that her heart had become as hard as the concrete in her buildings. But the truth was something only the night knew. Every evening, when the lights of the city began to glow and workers rushed home to their families, Isabella Grant returned alone to her enormous mansion that stood quietly on a hill outside the city. The mansion was beautiful. It had tall white pillars, a wide balcony, a large garden filled with flowers, and rooms so big that even laughter would echo inside them. But most nights, the house was silent. Too silent. The servants did their work quietly, the security guards stood at their posts, and Isabella would walk through the long hallways, hearing nothing but the soft sound of her own footsteps. Many years earlier, when she was still a young woman struggling to build her first business, tragedy had visited her home like a thief in the night. Both her parents passed away within a short time of each other. They were the only family she had. After that day, Isabella buried her sorrow inside her work. She told herself something again and again. Work hard, build your company, become strong, never depend on anyone. And she did exactly that. Year after year, she worked harder than everyone around her. She slept late and woke early. She chased deals, signed contracts, bought land, built properties. Slowly, her small company became a powerful empire. People clapped for her success. Newspapers wrote about her achievements. But none of them knew that when she returned home at night, she sometimes sat alone by the window and stared at the city lights with a heavy heart. Sometimes she would whisper softly into the quiet room, "Mama, Papa, I wish you could see what I have built." But only silence answered her. Life continued like this for many years. Every day, Isabella followed the same routine. In the morning, her black car carried her from the mansion to her office tower in the heart of the city. Throughout the day, she attended meetings, signed papers, and made decisions worth millions. And every evening, when the sun was sinking behind the buildings and the streets filled with the noise of traffic, her driver would take her back home. There was one particular traffic light her car always stopped at on the way out of the business district. It stood near a small bus stop where tired workers waited for transport to take them home. It was an ordinary place that most people never noticed: a small metal bench, a faded bus sign, a dusty sidewalk. But one evening, as Isabella sat quietly in the back seat of her car, watching the world through the tinted window, her eyes noticed something unusual. A young man was sitting on the bench at the bus stop. His clothes were old and torn. His shoes looked worn from many long walks. His hair was messy, like someone who had not seen a mirror in many days. From the way he looked, anyone could tell he was poor, maybe even homeless. Yet something about him was different, very different. He was not stretching out his hand to beg for money like others sometimes did at the traffic light. He was not shouting or disturbing anyone. He was simply sitting there quietly, watching people walk past as if he was searching for something he could not remember. Isabella glanced at him for only a moment before the traffic light turned green and the car drove away. She thought nothing more about it. But the next evening, when her car stopped at the same traffic light again, the young man was still there, sitting on the same bench, watching the same road, the same quiet face, the same strange calmness in his eyes. Isabella frowned slightly and leaned forward a little to look again. Her driver noticed her movement through the mirror. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" he asked. Isabella nodded slowly. "Yes, just drive." The car moved again, but something about that young man stayed in her thoughts. The following day, the same thing happened. The traffic light turned red, the car stopped, and there he was again, sitting quietly at the bus stop like a silent statue forgotten by the world. That evening, Isabella spoke softly from the back seat. "Driver?" "Yes, ma'am." "That young man who sits at the bus stop every day, have you noticed him before?" The driver glanced through the mirror and shrugged lightly. "Just another homeless person, I think. There are many in the city." Isabella did not answer immediately. She kept watching the young man through the window. He looked calm, but his eyes carried a sadness that felt deep, the kind of sadness that comes from losing something very important. Something about him stirred a strange feeling in her heart, a feeling she had not felt in a very long time. But Isabella Grant did not yet know that the quiet stranger at the bus stop was about to change her life forever. And the story of how that happened would soon shock the entire city. From that day on, something small but strange began to happen in Isabella Grant's life. Every evening, when her car slowed down at the traffic light near the small bus stop, the same young man was always there, always sitting on the same old metal bench as if the world had placed him there and forgotten to move him. His clothes were dirty and torn, the kind of clothes that told a story of many hard days and many cold nights. The sleeves of his shirt were worn thin, and the edges of his trousers looked as if they had touched too many dusty roads. His shoes had almost lost their shape. His hair was messy, thick, and uncombed, moving slightly whenever the evening wind passed by the roadside. Anyone who looked at him for the first time would quickly say, just another poor beggar struggling to survive. But if a person looked closely, really closely, they would notice something that did not match the picture of an ordinary street beggar. The young man never stretched his hand toward passing cars. He never called out to people. He never ran after drivers asking for coins. Many beggars around the city shouted loudly when they saw expensive cars, hoping someone inside might throw a little money through the window. But this young man did none of those things. He simply sat quietly on the bench, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his eyes calmly watching the river of people walking past the bus stop. Office workers hurried home with tired faces. Street traders pushed carts filled with fruit. Students laughed loudly as they waited for buses. And the young man watched them all in silence, like someone studying a world he could not fully understand. One evening, as Isabella's car waited at the red light again, she leaned slightly toward the window and watched him more carefully than before. Just then, an old woman carrying 2 heavy bags slowly stepped off the curb, trying to cross the busy road. Cars were rushing by quickly, their horns crying loudly in the evening traffic. The old woman looked frightened and unsure. Before anyone else could react, the young man quietly stood up from the bench. Without saying a word, he walked toward the old woman and gently took one of her bags. "Mother, let me help you," he said softly. His voice was calm and respectful. The old woman looked at him with surprise. "Ah, my son, thank you," she replied gratefully. Slowly, he guided her across the road, watching the traffic carefully until they reached the other side safely. When the old woman thanked him again and walked away, the young man simply returned to the bus stop and sat down again as if nothing important had happened. Isabella watched the whole scene from her car without saying a word. Something about the moment touched her heart in a quiet way she did not expect. The traffic light turned green and her car moved again, but the image stayed in her mind the entire ride home. The next evening, the same thing happened again. The young man was sitting on the bench, calm, silent, watching the world pass by. That day, Isabella noticed another small moment. A thin, stray dog wandered near the bus stop, sniffing the ground for food. Its ribs were showing, and its tail moved weakly as it searched for something to eat. The young man reached into a small paper bag beside him. Inside was a simple piece of bread. It was probably the only food he had for the evening. He looked at the bread for a moment, then looked at the hungry dog. Without hesitation, he broke the bread in half and placed the piece on the ground in front of the dog. The animal wagged its tail quickly and began eating. The young man smiled faintly, watching the dog enjoy the food. Then he quietly ate the smaller piece that remained in his hand. Isabella saw everything through the car window. She felt something tighten gently inside her chest. She whispered softly without realizing it, "Even when he has little, he still shares." Her driver glanced at her through the mirror but said nothing. Day after day, the same quiet scene repeated itself. The young man sat on the bench, calm, silent, watching people pass by, helping when someone needed help, asking for nothing, expecting nothing. Soon, Isabella found herself looking for him every evening, before the car even reached the traffic light. And every time she saw him sitting there, those calm eyes watching the world with a strange sadness, a quiet curiosity began growing inside her heart. She did not know the young man's name. She did not know where he came from. She did not know why a person who behaved with such kindness and quiet dignity was living like a forgotten man on the street. But one thing slowly became clear to Isabella Grant. This was not an ordinary beggar, and deep inside, a question had already begun whispering in her mind. Who was he really? And why did his calm eyes look like they were carrying a story the world had not yet heard? There was confusion in his face, but also something deeper, something almost painful, like a memory knocking on a locked door inside his mind. She whispered quietly, almost to herself, "He looks lost." The driver frowned slightly. "Lost?" Isabella nodded slowly. "Yes, like someone who has forgotten the road back home." Outside, the young man continued staring at the tall buildings for several seconds. Then he lowered his head again and looked down at his hands as if he was disappointed with himself. Isabella's chest tightened slightly when she saw that small movement. The driver spoke again, trying to end the conversation. Ma'am, people like him usually come from the villages looking for work. When they fail, they end up on the streets. Isabella did not answer immediately. Her eyes were still watching the quiet stranger on the bench. Something about the way he looked at the city, the way he watched those tall buildings, did not feel like the behavior of a man who had never belonged there. She spoke softly again. "Have you ever seen him talk to anyone?" The driver thought for a moment. "No, ma'am, I have never seen him speak." Isabella frowned slightly. "Not even once?" "Not once," the reply replied. The traffic light was still red. Around them, cars honked impatiently, and motorcycles squeezed through narrow spaces on the road. But inside Isabella's car, there was a strange silence. Her eyes remained fixed on the young man. At that moment, he slowly lifted his head again and looked once more toward the skyline of the city. The expression in his eyes was so deep, so full of quiet confusion, that Isabella felt something move inside her heart, like a small whisper she could not explain. She spoke again in a soft voice. "It looks like he is trying to remember something." The driver chuckled lightly. "Or maybe he is just dreaming about becoming rich, like the people in those buildings." Isabella did not smile. Instead, she continued watching the young man carefully. Deep inside her heart, a quiet feeling was growing stronger with every passing day. This was not just a homeless man sitting at a bus stop. There was a story hidden behind those calm eyes, a story that had not yet been told. And somehow, Isabella Grant felt that very soon that story would find its way into her life in a way she could never imagine. One night, the sky changed its mood without warning. The afternoon had been warm and quiet, but as evening approached, dark clouds slowly gathered above the city like a heavy blanket covering the sun. The wind began to whisper through the tall buildings, pushing dust along the roads and shaking the branches of the roadside trees. People looked up nervously at the sky because everyone in the city knew that when clouds gathered like that, a serious rainstorm was coming. Inside her office tower, Isabella Grant was finishing the last meeting of the day. Papers were signed, files were closed, and one by one the employees left the building to hurry home before the rain began. Isabella finally stood up from her desk and looked out of the tall glass window. The sky had turned dark gray. Lightning flashed silently in the distance like a warning from the heavens. Her assistant spoke softly beside her. "Ma'am, it looks like a big storm is coming." Isabella nodded calmly. "Yes, I should head home before the roads get worse." A few minutes later, her black car rolled out of the company parking area and entered the busy evening streets. The wind had grown stronger now, pushing against the sides of buildings and bending the small roadside trees. Suddenly, a loud rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Then the rain began. At first, it came as small drops tapping gently on the car windows, but within seconds, the sky opened completely, pouring heavy sheets of water onto the city. The rain fell so hard, it looked like the clouds had burst open. Cars rushed through the streets, trying to escape the storm. Drivers honked impatiently as they searched for clear roads. Pedestrians ran quickly, holding bags and newspapers over their heads as they rushed toward bus shelters and shop entrances. Some people laughed as they ran, while others shouted in frustration as the rain soaked their clothes. The streets were full of movement and noise. Inside her car, Isabella watched everything through the blurred window as raindrops raced down the glass like tiny rivers. The sound of the storm filled the air. Then, as always, her car approached the same traffic light near the small bus stop. The red light forced the car to stop. Isabella's eyes moved automatically toward the bench, and the moment she saw what was there, her heart tightened. The young man was still sitting at the bus stop. The rain had already soaked him completely. His shirt clung to his body, heavy with water. His trousers were dark with rain. Drops fell constantly from his messy hair down to his face. His arms were wrapped around himself slightly, as if trying to hold on to a little warmth. His shoulders trembled faintly from the cold. Yet, even in the middle of the storm, he was still sitting quietly on the same bench, still silent, still calm. As if the rain did not matter. As if the world had forgotten him completely. Isabella leaned forward slowly in her seat. Her eyes stayed on him. For a moment, she said nothing. The driver noticed her silence and glanced in the mirror. "Ma'am?" he asked gently. Isabella did not answer immediately. She continued watching the young man outside. The rain poured harder. Thunder cracked loudly across the sky, making some pedestrians scream as they ran for shelter. But the young man remained where he was, soaked and shivering under the storm. Finally, Isabella spoke softly, almost like someone thinking out loud. "He's still there." The driver followed her gaze and saw the man at the bus stop. He shook his head slightly. "Some people have nowhere else to go," he said. Isabella watched as a strong gust of wind pushed rain across the road like waves. The young man shivered again and lowered his head, but he still did not move from the bench. Something inside Isabella's chest twisted painfully. For days she had watched him from the safety of her car, always wondering about the quiet stranger with the sad eyes. But tonight, the sight of him sitting helplessly under the storm struck her heart in a way she could not ignore. She whispered softly, "He's freezing." The driver hesitated. "Ma'am, the storm is very strong tonight. It's better we keep moving once the light changes." Isabella remained silent for a moment. The rain kept falling heavily. Outside, the young man rubbed his arm slowly, trying to warm himself. And at that moment, Isabella felt something deep inside her heart. It was not curiosity anymore. It was something stronger, something human, something that would not allow her to simply drive away. Suddenly, she spoke firmly. "Stop the car." The driver blinked in surprise. "Ma'am?" "Stop the car," Isabella repeated calmly. Immediately, the driver pulled the car to the side of the road. The two bodyguards sitting in the front seat looked back in confusion. One of them asked quickly, "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Isabella opened the car door before anyone could stop her. The bodyguards were shocked. "Ma'am, the rain," one of them said urgently. But Isabella had already stepped out into the storm. The cold rain soaked her hair and clothes instantly as she closed the door behind her. The bodyguards rushed to follow her with umbrellas, but she was already walking toward the small bus stop through the heavy rain. Her shoes splashed softly on the wet road as thunder rumbled again above the city. The young man had not yet noticed her approaching. He was still sitting quietly on the bench, shivering slightly in the cold night air. And for the first time since she had noticed him many days ago, Isabella Grant was finally walking toward the mysterious stranger whose story was about to change both of their lives forever. The rain continued to fall heavily from the dark sky as Isabella Grant slowly walked toward the small bus stop. The cold wind pushed the rain sideways, and the sound of thunder rolled again across the city like a drum in the distance. Her bodyguards hurried behind her with umbrellas, but she had already stepped into the open rain before they could cover her. Her shoes touched the wet pavement softly as she approached the bench where the young man sat. For a moment, he did not notice her. He was looking down at the ground, his shoulders trembling slightly from the cold. Drops of rain ran down his hair and across his face, mixing with the water on his clothes. Then he slowly lifted his head, and there she was, standing right in front of him. The powerful businesswoman everyone in the city knew, Isabella Grant. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The rain fell between them like a curtain, and the world around them seemed to slow down. Cars rushed past on the road, their headlights shining through the storm. But inside that small space under the bus stop, there was only silence and the sound of falling rain. Isabella looked at the young man closely for the first time, not through the tinted glass of her car, not from a distance, but face to face. And what she saw surprised her deeply. Yes, his clothes were old and worn. Yes, his hair was messy and heavy with rain. Yes, his shoes looked like they had walked many long roads. But his face did not look like the face of a careless street beggar. There was something different about him. His face looked calm, gentle. His eyes, even though they were tired, carried a quiet intelligence inside them. The kind of eyes that seemed used to thinking deeply. The kind of eyes that belonged to someone who had once known a different life. Isabella studied him quietly, and the strange feeling she had felt many evenings before grew stronger inside her heart. The young man blinked slowly, confused by the sight of a well-dressed woman standing in front of him in the middle of a storm. Finally, Isabella spoke. Her voice was soft, almost kind, something very few people in her business world had ever heard from her. "Why are you sitting here in the rain?" she asked gently. The young man looked at her for a moment, as if trying to understand the question. His eyes moved briefly toward the falling rain, and then back to her face. He seemed unsure of what to say. His lips parted slightly before he answered. I don't know where else to go." His voice was calm, but uncertain, like someone speaking words that even he did not fully understand. Isabella felt her chest tighten slightly when she heard his answer. It was not the voice of a man begging for sympathy. It was the voice of someone who was simply lost. The young man looked down at his hands for a moment before speaking again slowly. "I tried to remember, but I can't." He lifted his head again, his eyes showing quiet confusion. "I don't remember where I came from." The rain continued to fall heavily around them. One of the bodyguards stepped forward and held an umbrella over Isabella's head, but she barely noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on the young man sitting on the bench. Something about his words touched a place deep inside her heart. She could hear the honesty in his voice. There was no trick, no performance, only confusion and quiet sadness. She asked softly, "You don't remember anything?" The young man shook his head slowly. "Only small things, pieces that don't make sense." His voice grew softer as he continued. "Sometimes I feel like I should know something important, but it's gone." For a brief moment, he looked toward the city skyline again, the tall buildings shining faintly through the rain and darkness. His expression looked almost painful. "When I look at those buildings, it feels like I should remember something about them." He paused and then added quietly, "But I can't." Isabella felt a deep wave of pity move through her chest. She stood there silently for several seconds, watching the young man shiver in the cold rain while trying to hold together pieces of a life he could not remember. Inside her mind, two voices began arguing with each other. One voice spoke with the cold logic she had used all her life. It warned her not to get involved. It told her this was not her problem. But another voice, softer and warmer, spoke from a deeper place in her heart. It whispered something very simple. "This man needs help." Isabella looked at the young man again. Rain continued dripping from his hair onto his tired face. His hands were trembling slightly from the cold. Finally, she took a quiet breath. She hesitated for only a moment. Then she said something no one in the world expected Isabella Grant to say. "Come with me." The young man blinked slowly, surprised by the words. "What?" he asked softly. Isabella repeated calmly, her voice steady despite the storm around them. "Come with me." The bodyguards behind her exchanged shocked looks. Even the driver, watching from the car, could hardly believe what he had just heard. But Isabella did not take her eyes off the young man. She continued gently, "You cannot stay here in the rain." The young man stared at her, unsure if he had heard correctly. And in that quiet moment, as thunder rolled again across the dark sky, neither of them fully understood that the simple words she had just spoken were about to begin a story that would change both of their lives forever. The rain continued to pour as Isabella Grant led the young man away from the bus stop toward her waiting car. The bodyguards quickly opened the door, still exchanging confused looks with each other. They had protected Isabella for many years, and they had seen many surprising things in her life, but never had they seen her bring a stranger from the street into her car. The young man hesitated slightly before stepping inside. He looked at the clean leather seat as if he was afraid he might dirty it with his wet clothes. Isabella noticed his hesitation and said softly, "It's all right. Sit down." Her voice was calm but firm. Slowly, the young man stepped inside the car and sat carefully at the edge of the seat. Water dripped from his clothes onto the floor mat. The driver started the engine again, and the car moved away from the stormy street. Inside the car, there was silence. The young man looked out the window as the city lights blurred through the falling rain. His expression was still confused, like someone who had suddenly stepped into a life that did not belong to him. Isabella sat quietly beside him, her mind filled with many thoughts she could not explain. A few minutes later, the car turned off the main road and began climbing the quiet hill where her mansion stood. The tall iron gates slowly opened as the car approached. Security guards saluted respectfully as the car passed through. The mansion lights glowed warmly against the dark, rainy night. The car stopped at the front entrance under the large stone archway. Servants quickly rushed out with umbrellas to welcome their employer home. But when they saw the soaked stranger stepping out of the car beside Isabella, their eyes widened in surprise. The house staff looked at one another in confusion. None of them dared ask questions, but their faces clearly showed their shock. Even the security guards standing near the entrance leaned closer to whisper quietly among themselves. "Who is that man?" one guard murmured. "I don't know," another replied softly, "but Madam brought him herself." Isabella heard the whispers, but paid them no attention. She walked straight toward the entrance with the young man following slowly behind her, looking around the large mansion with quiet disbelief. The tall ceilings, the shining floors, the bright lights, everything looked like a different world compared to the bus stop where he had been sitting only a short time ago. Isabella turned to the house staff and spoke calmly. "Prepare the guest's bathroom." The servants blinked in surprise, but quickly nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Within minutes, the staff hurried to prepare fresh towels, soap, and clean clothes. One of the maids gently led the young man down the hallway toward the guest's bathroom. He looked back once toward Isabella, as if unsure if he should really be there. She gave him a small, reassuring nod. "Go and wash," she said softly. "You need warmth." The young man disappeared into the bathroom, leaving small drops of water along the polished floor behind him. For a moment, the house staff stood quietly, still confused by the situation. One of the older servants finally whispered carefully, "Ma'am, should we prepare food as well?" Isabella nodded slowly. "Yes, something warm." Soon the sound of running water filled the quiet hallway as the young man took his shower. The rain outside continued tapping softly against the windows of the mansion. After some time, the bathroom door slowly opened again. The young man stepped out wearing a set of clean clothes the staff had provided. For a moment, everyone who saw him stopped and stared in surprise. Without the dirt and soaked clothing, he looked like a completely different person. His face was clear now. His hair, though still slightly messy, showed its natural shape. His posture looked straight and natural, and his features, they were strikingly handsome. One of the younger maids quietly whispered to another, "Is that really the same man?" The other maid nodded slowly, still staring. The young man noticed the looks but seemed uncomfortable with the attention. His eyes moved around the room with quiet uncertainty. Even though he now looked like someone who belonged in a place like this, his expression still carried the same deep confusion Isabella had seen before. Isabella stepped closer and looked at him carefully. She could see clearly now what she had sensed earlier. This man had not always been a beggar. There was dignity in the way he stood, even when he looked unsure. She spoke gently. "You must feel better now." The young man nodded slightly. "Yes, thank you." His voice was calm but still uncertain. Isabella gestured toward the chair near the dining table. "Sit down." He obeyed slowly, sitting carefully as if he still felt like a guest in someone else's life. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The servants quietly placed a warm meal on the table and then stepped away. Finally, Isabella asked a question that had been waiting in her mind since the bus stop. "Tell me, who are you?" The young man looked down at his hands. His fingers tightened slightly as if he was struggling with something painful. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet sadness. "I wish I knew." Isabella frowned slightly. "You truly don't remember?" He slowly shook his head. "No." He paused before continuing softly. "I don't remember my past." Isabella felt a small chill move through her chest when she heard the words. The young man continued speaking slowly, as if each sentence was difficult to form. "I don't know my name." His eyes lifted briefly before lowering again. "I don't know if I have a family." The room fell silent as his words hung in the air. After a moment, he added quietly, "The only thing I remember is waking up near the roadside weeks ago." His voice trembled slightly as he spoke the last sentence. "I was lying there alone, with no memory of how I got there." Isabella watched him carefully as he spoke. The sadness in his voice sounded too real to be a lie. In that moment, she realized something deeply painful about the stranger sitting in front of her. This man had not only lost his home, he had lost his entire life, and neither of them knew that the truth behind that lost life was far more shocking than anyone in that mansion could possibly imagine. After that rainy night, Isabella Grant decided that the young man could not simply leave or return to the streets. The mansion was large, but she had a small guest house near the garden that usually remained empty. It was a simple building with a wooden door, whitewashed walls, and a small veranda that looked over the flowers and trees. She led him there gently, holding his soaked hand for a brief moment to guide him safely. "This will be your room for now," she said softly. The young man looked around quietly, taking in the modest space. A bed with fresh sheets, a small wooden table, and a chair were all that filled the room. It was simple, yet it was warmth and shelter after the cold rain and long days on the street. I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice calm but uncertain. Isabella smiled faintly. "You do not need to say anything. You are safe here." Over the next few days, Isabella found ways to keep him occupied. She gave him a small job to help around the garden. He began by assisting the gardener, carrying buckets of water, pulling weeds, and sweeping fallen leaves. Sometimes he watered the flowers, watching each bloom carefully, as if he understood the patience it took to grow them. Sometimes he swept the yard from dawn until late afternoon, his sleeves rolled up, his movements careful and precise. Even when the sun was hot or the rain fell again, he never complained. The staff of the mansion watched him quietly at first. They had expected someone who lived on the streets to be rude, lazy, or difficult. But Daniel, as Isabella had begun to call him, because he could not remember his real name, Daniel was different. He was polite to everyone. "Good morning, sir," he would say to the gardener with a small nod. "Yes, madam," he would answer the housemaids if they asked him to carry something. "Thank you, madam," he would whisper softly when someone handed him a tool or offered a helping hand. Slowly, the staff began to warm to him. They noticed the way he worked quietly, never asking for praise, never arguing, never refusing any task. "He is a good boy," one of the maids whispered to another one evening as Daniel carefully trimmed the rose bushes. "I've never seen anyone like him," another replied. Even the gardener, a man who had worked with Isabella for many years and was used to people giving excuses, shook his head in quiet admiration. "This one, he is special," he said quietly as he handed Daniel another bucket of water. Isabella watched all of this from her balcony one afternoon, her hands folded over the railing. She could not stop noticing how the young man moved with care, how his eyes followed the flowers, and how his hands handled every task as if he had been born to do them. Yet, despite his diligence and calmness, there was still that shadow of confusion in his eyes. He looked at the mansion sometimes as if he could sense that it belonged to someone else, a life he had forgotten. One afternoon, when Daniel returned from watering the garden, Isabella called him gently. "Come here, please," she said. He approached slowly, still polite, still quiet. "I have been thinking," she began. "Since you cannot remember your name, I would like to give you one. Something to call you by, something that feels good to say." Daniel looked at her, tilting his head slightly. You would do that?" he asked softly. Isabella smiled faintly. "Yes, I believe everyone deserves a name, even if the world has forgotten them for a while." She paused for a moment, then said softly, "I will call you Daniel." Daniel blinked slowly, as if tasting the word on his tongue for the first time. "Daniel," he repeated quietly, "it feels good." Isabella nodded. "Then it is settled. From now on, you are Daniel." That simple act, a name given from kindness, seemed to change something inside him. He continued working hard, tending the garden, cleaning the yard, watering the flowers, always polite, always calm, and yet now there was a small spark of something new in his eyes. The staff continued to notice it. "Madam," one of the maids whispered to Isabella one evening, "Daniel smiles now when he works. Before, he only looked lost." Isabella watched him from her balcony again that night, Daniel bending over the flower beds and a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The wind rustled through the trees, the night birds sang softly, and for the first time, Isabella felt a strange lightness in her heart. The quiet man she had found in the rain, the man with no past and no name, was slowly becoming a part of the life around her. Yet, even as she watched, she could not shake the thought that somewhere, in a world beyond her garden, a story was waiting to catch up with Daniel, a story that would soon change everything. Over the next few weeks, Isabella began to notice things about Daniel that puzzled her more and more each day. At first, she had only seen him as quiet, polite, and diligent, but slowly a new layer of him began to appear, something strange and unexpected. It started with small things. One afternoon, Isabella was sitting at the large oak table in her home office, surrounded by papers and documents. She was tired, her eyes sore from hours of reading through financial reports. She frowned as she rubbed her temple. "This cannot be right," she muttered under her breath. Daniel had been nearby, watering the flowers by the window. When he saw her frown, he walked quietly into the office, his wet hands carefully folded behind him. Without hesitation, he leaned over the edge of the table and pointed at one of the columns in the financial report. "Here, madam," he said softly. "This number is off. It should be—" He spoke the correct figure without hesitation. Isabella froze. Her hand trembled slightly as she looked at the page. How do you know this?" she asked, her voice sharp with surprise. Daniel blinked slowly, confusion flickering across his calm face. I don't know," he whispered. "It just felt wrong." She stared at him, unsure whether to scold him for intruding or to be amazed at what he had just done. The world outside the office seemed to stop for a moment, as if the rain from the other night still lingered in the air between them. Another day, a problem arose with one of the house's computer systems. The screens were frozen, programs unresponsive, and even the technicians Isabella called could not fix it. Daniel was nearby, sweeping leaves in the garden. Isabella hesitated for a moment before asking, almost instinctively, "Daniel, can you try?" He looked at her, surprised, but nodded silently. He entered the room, sat down at the keyboard, and began typing. His fingers moved faster than she had ever seen, flying across the keys with a confidence and skill that seemed impossible for someone who had only lived on the streets weeks ago. He bypassed errors, typed commands, and in minutes, the system whirred back to life. Isabella watched, her mouth slightly open, a mix of astonishment and worry filling her chest. You did all that? Like you have done it all your life," she said slowly. Daniel looked at the screen, then back at her, a shadow of confusion in his eyes. I don't know how. he whispered. I just remember what to do. Isabella felt a cold shiver run through her. How could someone who did not remember their own life know so much? Who was this man really? She wanted to ask him again, to demand answers, but Daniel did not have them. He simply looked at her quietly, polite, humble, and yet undeniably intelligent. She realized then that the young man she had rescued from the rain was not just kind and hardworking. He carried knowledge and skill hidden inside him, locked away by whatever tragedy had erased his past. Every day brought a new surprise. Sometimes it was numbers, sometimes machines, sometimes ideas for organizing the garden or fixing a broken tool in the house. And yet, despite all this, Daniel still could not remember who he was. He still did not know his name, his family, or where he had come from. And every night, when he returned to his small room in the guest house, he would sit quietly, staring at the ceiling, as if hoping that one day something would come back to him. Isabella watched him sometimes from her balcony, the moonlight falling softly across the garden. She felt a strange mixture of admiration and sadness. He was brilliant, capable, and polite, yet so lost. And deep inside her, a quiet thought began to grow, a thought she did not dare speak aloud yet. One day, the world outside would demand answers about Daniel. One day, someone would come looking. But for now, he was here, and she could not let him face the world alone. She whispered softly into the night, "Who are you, Daniel? Who were you before the rain took you?" And in the silence that answered her, even the storm of questions in her heart felt small compared to the storm she knew was coming. Months passed quietly in the mansion, but each day brought small changes that Isabella Grant could not ignore. Daniel had become a part of her daily life, not just a guest in the small house near the garden, but someone whose presence she began to notice in ways she had never noticed another person before. In the mornings, he would help with the garden, his hands moving carefully among the flowers, the leaves, and the trees. By afternoon, he would assist the staff in small ways, fixing a broken tool, organizing a corner of the yard, or carrying water for the plants. And sometimes, as the sun began to sink behind the tall buildings in the distance, Daniel and Isabella would walk quietly in the garden together. The flowers smelled sweet after the rain, and the soft wind carried the faint songs of the birds returning to their nests. "The roses are growing well," Isabella would say softly, trying to keep the conversation light, not daring to speak the words in her heart. "Yes, madam," Daniel would answer politely, and then, almost quietly, he would add, "If you move the sunlight trellis slightly to the east, they will bloom even faster." Isabella blinked. "You notice these things?" she asked softly, trying not to sound too impressed. Daniel shrugged, his calm eyes meeting hers. "I just see them," he said simply. In the evenings, when the staff had finished their work and the garden was quiet, Isabella sometimes brought out a small teapot and 2 cups. They would sit together on the veranda, sipping warm tea as the sky turned soft shades of orange and purple. They did not always speak much. Sometimes the sound of the garden and the distant city was enough. But sometimes Daniel would speak, and his words were simple yet sharp, full of insight that Isabella could not ignore. One evening, she spread a few papers across the veranda table, a business proposal she had been struggling with. Daniel leaned over slightly, his eyes scanning the documents quickly. "If you adjust this number here and restructure this department's budget, the company could increase profit by almost 20%, he said softly. Isabella froze, staring at him. "Daniel, where do you learn this?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked down at the papers as if seeing them for the first time. I don't know," he said softly, the familiar confusion in his voice. "It just seems right." Isabella let out a small breath and nodded, feeling both amazed and puzzled. Slowly, the weeks passed. Daniel's advice, his ideas, his quiet brilliance began to touch the company in ways Isabella had never imagined. Profits grew, operations ran smoother, staff smiled more at the office when they learned Daniel's thoughts, though they only heard them secondhand from Isabella. Yet for Isabella, it was not the money or the work that filled her thoughts. It was Daniel. She began noticing small things, the way his hair fell softly across his forehead, the gentle curve of his lips when he smiled, the calm patience in his eyes as he studied something deeply. She found herself caring about him more than she had expected. She looked forward to seeing him each day. She smiled quietly when he entered the garden, carrying a small watering can, always polite, always careful. But deep inside, Isabella hid her feelings. She reminded herself constantly, "He is just a poor man I helped. He is someone without a past. He does not belong to my world." She could not let herself admit the truth, that she had begun to depend on him, that his presence had filled the loneliness she had carried for so many years. Some evenings, when Daniel walked beside her in the garden, she would ask casually, "Do you enjoy your work here, Daniel?" He would look at her and smile faintly. "Yes, I like it," he said. "I feel useful." Isabella's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to say more, to tell him how important he had become to her, but she did not. Instead, she nodded and said softly, "I am glad." And yet, every time she turned away from him, she felt the quiet ache of a heart beginning to care for someone it should not. Every time she saw his eyes, so calm yet so lost, she felt the small tug of something she could not name. Slowly, day by day, Isabella realized that her life, once filled with work and silence, was now shaped by the quiet presence of Daniel, and she could not help wondering, though she would never say it aloud, what would happen if the world discovered the truth about him, or if he remembered the life he had lost. For now, in the soft evenings, sipping tea together in the quiet garden, Isabella allowed herself only a secret thought. She cared for Daniel more than she should, and yet she could not stop it. One quiet afternoon, the garden was calm. Daniel was trimming the rose bushes, while Isabella sat on the veranda reading some papers. The sun was warm, and the birds sang softly, the kind of quiet that made the mansion feel like a world apart from the city. Suddenly, a loud sound broke through the air. A deep roar of engines echoed across the driveway, and Isabella looked up quickly. Her heart skipped a beat. Outside the gates, several black SUVs had screeched to a stop. Tires screeched against the wet pavement, and dust rose as the cars halted abruptly. The security guards at the entrance jumped immediately, their hands reaching for radios and walkie-talkies. The sound of doors opening thundered through the courtyard. Men in sharp suits stepped out of the vehicles, tall, serious, and powerful. Their eyes scanned the grounds, and they carried a sense of authority that made even the guards stiffen. One of the suited men began speaking quickly into a radio, and then he pulled out photographs, showing them to the guards at the gate. The images were clear. A man, soaked in rain, sitting on a roadside, now standing before them? The guards whispered amongst themselves, eyes wide with shock. Isabella rose from her chair, her pulse quickening. "Who are they?" she murmured, almost to herself. Daniel, unaware of the commotion, continued trimming the flowers, humming softly, the sunlight glinting on his hair. Then, one of the men in suits caught sight of him. He froze, his eyes widening. The photographs were in his hand. He looked at Daniel, then back at the pictures. "Sir!" he shouted suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet of the garden like lightning. Daniel froze, his hands still on the shears, his eyes blinking in confusion. He looked toward the sound, then at the men who were rushing forward with a mixture of urgency and awe. The suited men ran quickly across the garden, their faces serious and commanding. Isabella stood rooted to the spot, watching, her mind spinning. She could see Daniel's expression change slowly, confusion mixing with the dawning realization that something far beyond this garden, far beyond the life he had known here with her, was happening. "Sir, sir, are you Daniel Kane?" one of the men called out, holding out a photograph. Daniel's lips parted. He stared at the faces before him, at the cars, at the men running, and then back at Isabella. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came at first. The garden, once peaceful, now felt charged with a strange electricity. The flowers swayed lightly in the sudden breeze, the birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Isabella's heart pounded. She took a cautious step toward Daniel, unsure whether to speak or to stay silent. "Daniel, what is happening?" she asked softly. Daniel looked at her, his eyes wide, the calmness that had always defined him replaced with a flicker of fear and confusion. I don't know," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. One of the men in suits reached him and took a careful step closer. "Sir, you have been missing for weeks. We have been looking for you everywhere." Daniel's gaze drifted from the man to Isabella, then back to the men around him. "Missing me?" he asked quietly. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the handles of the shears. Isabella's chest tightened. Something powerful and unspoken was happening. The man shouted again, louder this time, almost in disbelief. "Sir, this is the man that was homeless days ago." The words echoed through the garden. Daniel blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of everything: the men, the cars, the photographs, the voice that now seemed to call him a man he did not remember being. Isabella reached out instinctively, her hand brushing his arm. "Daniel, it's all right," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. But even as she spoke, the world outside the mansion had begun to descend on the garden. The quiet life they had built in the small house and the flowers, the calm afternoons and the gentle tea evenings, all seemed to hover in that moment, suspended, waiting for Daniel to remember who he was, or for the world to demand the truth of him. The men in suits ran quickly across the garden, their polished shoes splashing in the soft earth, their faces serious and urgent. Daniel stood frozen, the shears still clutched in his hands, his eyes wide, heart pounding. One of the men stopped just in front of him, his voice firm, commanding, shaking slightly with excitement. "Mr. Alexander Kane," he called loudly. The words hung in the air like thunder. Daniel's body stiffened. "Alexander Kane?" he whispered, his voice small and uncertain, almost as if speaking the name aloud might make it real. Isabella stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Daniel, do you know him?" she asked softly. Daniel shook his head slowly, confusion flickering across his face. The men in suits looked at each other, then began speaking rapidly, their words tumbling out all at once, urgent, like the pouring rain on that fateful night when Isabella had first seen him at the bus stop. "Sir, months ago you were in a terrible car accident. Your car crashed during a storm. We thought you were lost forever." Daniel's lips parted, but no sound came. He blinked rapidly, trying to absorb the words. One of the men showed him a photograph. The image was of a young man in a tailored suit, smiling confidently in front of a tall building. "This is you, Mr. Kane," he said gently. "You are the CEO of the largest technology company in the country, one of the richest men in the city." Daniel's hands shook slightly as he looked at the photograph. He lowered his gaze, trying to process the truth that had been hidden from him all these weeks. Isabella's heart ached as she watched him. The man she had called Daniel, the quiet, kind, gentle man who had no past, had been carrying the weight of a life he did not remember. I don't understand," Daniel murmured, his voice trembling. One of the men stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The accident caused temporary memory loss, sir. You woke up near a roadside weeks ago. We have searched the entire country for you. Everyone thought you were gone." Daniel shook his head slowly, tears welling in his eyes. His gaze moved from the men to Isabella, and his voice broke. "All this time, I was missing, and I don't even remember my own life." Isabella's hand moved to his face, brushing away a stray wet strand of hair. "It's all right," she whispered softly. "You're here now. You're safe." Daniel's lips trembled as he tried to speak again. "But my family, my work, everything." The men in suits nodded solemnly. We will take care of everything, sir. You have people waiting for you. Family, colleagues, everything is ready. Daniel's eyes searched Isabella's, the place he had called home for months. The garden, the flowers, the small house where he had begun to feel safe and warm, all of it pressed against his memory like a dream he could not fully grasp. Isabella's heart ached as she watched him. The man she had called Daniel, the quiet, kind, gentle man who had no past, had been carrying the weight of a life he did not remember. I don't understand, Daniel murmured, his voice trembling. One of the men stepped closer, lowering his voice. The accident caused temporary memory loss, sir. You woke up near a roadside weeks ago. We have searched the entire country for you. Everyone thought you were gone. Daniel shook his head slowly, tears welling in his eyes. His gaze moved from the men to Isabella, and his voice broke. All this time, I was missing, and I don't even remember my own life. Isabella's hand moved to his face, brushing away a stray wet strand of hair. It's all right, she whispered softly. You're here now. You're safe. Daniel's lips trembled as he tried to speak again. But my family, my work, everything. The men in suits nodded solemnly. We will take care of everything, sir. You have people waiting for you. Family, colleagues, everything is ready. Daniel's eyes searched Isabella's, the place he had called home for months. The garden, the flowers, the small house where he had begun to feel safe and warm, all of it pressed against his memory like a dream he could not fully grasp. Isabella's heart ached as she watched him. The man she had called Daniel, the quiet, kind, gentle man who had no past, had been carrying the weight of a life he did not remember. I don't understand, Daniel murmured, his voice trembling. You have a choice. Daniel closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. I feel like I belong here, with you. The men in suits exchanged glances, unsure if they should speak or let the moment remain between the two of them. The air in the garden felt heavy, the storm from months ago seeming to echo softly in the rustling leaves, in the quiet whisper of the wind. Daniel took a deep breath, the truth of who he was and the life he had lost pressing against him. And yet, in that moment, he realized something that no money, no power, no title could ever give him. Here, in the quiet garden, with the woman who had rescued him from the rain, he had found something more important than his lost empire. He had found a place where he was seen, valued, and cared for. The realization made him falter, and his voice broke as he whispered again. All this time, I am Alexander Kane, but you were the one you saved me when I had nothing. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Yes, she said softly, and I will not let you face the world alone. The suited men waited, tense and silent, as Daniel looked around the garden once more, the flowers swaying in the soft breeze, the sun beginning to shine through the clouds, and the truth of who he was and who he had become slowly settling in his heart. When Alexander heard the name, his real name, something inside him shifted, like the turning of a great key in a locked door. The moment the words Alexander Kane were spoken, a spark lit behind his eyes. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow of recognition that made his chest tighten. Then, slowly, fragments of memories began flashing in his mind. The first was a tall glass building, gleaming in the sunlight. He could see himself walking down a long corridor, papers in his hand, a phone pressed to his ear. He remembered the voices of people calling his name, the familiar sound of his own confident steps echoing across polished floors. Then another memory came. His office, dark mahogany walls, the smell of leather, the hum of computers. He saw charts, graphs, numbers, decisions he had made, and the weight of responsibility that had always pressed on him. A sudden wave of emotion struck him. He saw his staff, busy and loyal, waiting for guidance. He saw his family, their faces soft and familiar, their eyes full of love and worry. He remembered meetings, contracts, deals, and the bustling life of a man who had been at the top of the city, commanding respect, wealth, and power. His hands trembled as the memories came faster now, overlapping, racing. The car crash, the storm, the roadside, everything that had been lost in the darkness of his mind returned in fragments and flashes, painful and beautiful all at once. Isabella watched him carefully, her hand still resting gently on his arm. "Alexander?" she asked softly. His eyes, wide and shimmering with tears, finally met hers. I remember," he whispered, his voice breaking. I know who I am now. I am Alexander Kane." The suited men stepped closer, their faces solemn but urgent. "Sir," one of them said, his tone respectful but insistent, "you must return immediately. Your company needs you. The media is already searching for you. Everything has been waiting for your return." Alexander nodded slowly, his mind still trying to catch up with the flood of memories. He could feel the weight of it all, the empire he had built, the responsibilities he carried, the lives depending on him. Yet even as he stood there in the garden, the wind rustling the flowers, the sun breaking through the clouds, his gaze kept returning to Isabella. She had been the one constant in the storm of his lost weeks. She had given him food when he had nothing, shelter when he had nowhere to sleep, kindness when the world had ignored him. I have to go back," he whispered to her, his voice trembling. "But I don't want to leave this place, or you." Isabella's heart ached at his words. She stepped closer, her hand resting against his chest. "Alexander, whatever the world wants from you, remember this," she said softly. "You do not have to face it alone. You have a choice." The men in suits looked uneasy, glancing at each other. "Sir, the country, your company, your people, they cannot wait much longer," one said. Alexander took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked once more around the garden, at the flowers swaying in the gentle breeze, at the small guest house that had been his refuge, and then at Isabella. You were the only one who saw me when I had nothing," he whispered, tears glistening in his eyes. You are the only person His voice faltered, caught in the weight of everything he had lost and found. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling. "And you are the only one I trust, Alexander," she said softly. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The distant roar of engines, the black SUVs waiting at the gate, the men in suits, the garden, the flowers, the sunlight breaking through clouds. It all faded into silence around them. Alexander closed his eyes, letting the flood of memories settle inside him. He had finally remembered who he was, yet in that moment, he realized that his life before, all the wealth and power, meant nothing without the kindness, the care, the quiet love that Isabella had given him in the storm. The suited men shifted uneasily, waiting for him to act. "Sir," one said. Alexander opened his eyes, looking at Isabella once more. I will go back, but I will not forget who saw me when I was lost." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers. In the quiet of the garden, a man who had lost everything and a woman who had saved him stood together, knowing that the next chapter of their lives, one of wealth, power, and responsibility, would also carry a truth far greater than any fortune, the bond that had grown between them in the weeks of rain, care, and quiet conversations that no memory could erase. Alexander paused at the edge of the driveway, the black SUVs waiting, their engines rumbling like impatient beasts. The suited men hovered nearby, tense and alert, unsure if he would obey or bolt back to the world he had remembered. The wind rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers, the same garden where he had spent quiet days with Isabella, the garden that had become a place of warmth and refuge. Isabella stood on the veranda, her heart heavy, her hands clutching the railing. She could not speak. The words seemed too big, too overwhelming for the quiet space of the garden. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her, unwavering. He walked back toward her, each step firm and steady, the shears of the garden long forgotten in his hands. The suited men froze, the guards stiffened, and even the staff peeking from the mansion windows held their breath. When he reached the veranda, he stopped, standing just a few feet away from Isabella. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling, as if gathering every word he had ever wanted to speak. And then he spoke, his voice soft yet carrying across the garden, clear and certain. "When I had money," he said slowly, almost as if tasting the words, "people respected me because I was rich. They bowed, they smiled, they listened, but they only saw the name, the title, the fortune." His eyes glistened with emotion. "But when I had nothing, nothing at all, you treated me like a human being." Isabella's lips parted slightly, her hands trembling against the railing. She could not speak. The words seemed too big, too overwhelming for the quiet space of the garden. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her, unwavering. "The woman who saved me," he said, his voice low and full of quiet strength. "The woman who fed me, sheltered me, gave me a name when the world had forgotten me. She is the woman I want beside me." The air seemed to still around them. The suited men exchanged stunned glances, unable to believe what they were hearing. The staff pressed against the windows, eyes wide, hearts beating fast. Even the guards at the gate looked as if they had been struck by lightning. Isabella's heart raced, tears threatening to spill. She felt warmth flood through her chest, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and a joy she had never dared to imagine. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she had cared for him all this time, that her own heart had been quietly breaking every day she thought he would leave, but the words caught in her throat, swept away by the rawness of the moment. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her, unwavering. "I do not care about the world I lost," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I do not care about wealth, fame, or power. All I want, all I need is you." The tears came then, spilling freely down Isabella's cheeks. She finally found her voice, trembling, choked with emotion. "Alexander, Daniel, I... She could not finish, words breaking apart under the weight of her feelings. He reached her then, gently taking her hand in his. "I saved you when you were lost, and now I will not leave you, not ever." The garden, the flowers, the wind, the sun breaking through the clouds, it all seemed to hold its breath as two hearts that had been waiting for this moment finally recognized one another. The world beyond the garden could wait. The black SUVs, the men in suits, the empire that demanded him, they could all wait, because in that quiet, trembling moment, Alexander Kane and Isabella Grant found each other, and everything else faded into silence, leaving only the truth of their hearts. Months passed after that unforgettable day in the garden. Alexander had returned to his life, reclaiming the empire that had been waiting for him, yet he never forgot the quiet garden, the small house, or the woman who had seen him when he had nothing. And Isabella had never stopped thinking about him, about the gentle, kind man she had known as Daniel, and the powerful, brilliant man he had become. Then the day came, the day the city would remember forever, the wedding of Alexander Kane and Isabella Grant. The streets were filled with excitement. Rumors spread quickly, reporters snapping photographs, cameras flashing, everyone eager to witness the union of the richest businessman in the city and the woman who had saved him when he had nothing. Thousands of guests arrived, dressed in their finest clothes, their voices mingling with the soft music playing from the orchestra. The air was thick with perfume and flowers, the scent of roses and jasmine floating through the grand hall, the same flowers that had grown in Isabella's garden, the flowers that had witnessed the beginning of their story. Yet, amidst all the grandeur, the glittering lights, the polite laughter of the wealthy and powerful, the most beautiful moments happened quietly, in the spaces no one else could see. Alexander walked slowly toward Isabella, his eyes never leaving hers, his hand holding hers gently. The room hushed as he leaned close, his lips brushing her ear. "You didn't save a billionaire that night," he whispered softly, so only she could hear. "You saved a lost man." Isabella's heart trembled at the words. She felt the warmth of his breath, the steady strength in his hand, and for the first time, she allowed herself to release all the fears she had carried, the fear that he would leave, the fear that she was too small a part of his world. "A lost man," she murmured, tears glistening in her eyes, her voice trembling. "And I found him." He smiled gently, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "No, Isabella, you didn't just find him. You gave him life again. You gave him hope. You gave him kindness when the world had forgotten him." She pressed her forehead to his, their hands clasped tightly, and in that quiet, their hearts spoke a language that no wealth, no titles, no fame could ever reach. The music swelled, the guests applauded politely, and the cameras captured the spectacle. Yet all that mattered in that instant was the truth between them. The greatest wealth in life, Isabella realized finally, was not gold or land, not power or influence, but the simple, quiet act of kindness that had bridged two souls across rain, loss, and memory. Alexander kissed her gently, whispering again, "And now, Isabella, my greatest fortune is you." She smiled through her tears, letting herself be carried by the warmth of the moment, the soft wind carrying petals from the flowers in the hall. In the eyes of the city, it was a wedding of wealth and prestige, but in the hearts of Isabella and Alexander, it was the celebration of something far richer, love born of compassion, trust built in the quiet of the storm, and the knowledge that even the humblest act of kindness could create the greatest miracles. And as they stood together, hand in hand, the city watched, but only they felt the full weight of the journey that had brought them here. The lonely girl who gave food, warmth, and hope, and the lost man who found himself again, not in riches, but in the heart of someone who had seen him when the world had turned away.